The Earth 900,000 years ago was a planet of edges and contrasts. This was not the stable, familiar world we know today, but a restless globe shaped by long rhythms of ice and fire. The climate moved in colossal cycles, glacial periods in which ice sheets reached down from the poles, locking away oceans and remaking continents, followed by warmer interludes that lasted only a geological breath. Humanity, still in its infancy, lived not in one world but in many, each shaped by the slow pulse of planetary change. Forests once thick with fruit thinned into savannas of dry grass. Rivers that had carved valleys for thousands of years suddenly shrank or shifted course, leaving once fertile plains cracked and barren. Herds of animals, giant elephants, rhinoceroses, antelopes and predators, unlike anything we know, migrated with the seasons, and humans had no choice but to follow. For them, survival was a perpetual chase, an unending adaptation to a landscape that never stayed the same. Life at this time was fragile. Our ancestors lived in small groups, scattered and isolated, rarely numbering more than a few dozen. They depended entirely on the rhythms of the earth, with no safety net, no stored food, no technology beyond stone, fire and cooperation. They hunted with tools chipped from flint and obsidian, sharp enough to cut flesh but blunt compared to the claws and fangs of the predators that stalked them. They sheltered in caves or makeshift huts of branches and hides, but none of it could hold against storms or against hunger. The skies themselves were unstable. Dust storms swept across drying plains, rains came and vanished, winters stretched into years of frost. To live in such a world was to exist on a knife's edge, where every mistake could mean death, and yet they endured. Their very existence was proof of resilience, of an ability to read the land, to listen to the patterns of animals, to share knowledge from one generation to the next in the only way they could, through memory, gesture and primitive voice. 900,000 years ago, the Earth hosted more than one kind of human. Our lineage was not alone. Other species walked beside us. Homo erectus, strong-bodied and long-legged, capable of traveling vast distances, early relatives who left traces in Asia and Africa, and still others whose identities are lost to time, their bones scattered in caves and buried under stone. These were not yet Homo sapiens, but they were our kin, and their fate was tied to the same fragile web of survival. This was the stage upon which the great crisis would soon arrive. The planet was already restless, but what came next was not just another swing of climate. It was a catastrophe, a bottleneck so severe that almost all of humanity would vanish. Entire populations, entire lineages were wiped out, leaving only a sliver of survivors. From them and them alone, the story of us would continue. They could not have known it as they walked the grasslands, chipped stones into tools, or gathered around the glow of fragile fire. To them, life was already hard, already balanced on the edge of hunger and safety. Yet in the centuries to come, the world would tighten its grip even further. And when it did, 99% of their kind would be erased. 900,000 years ago, the human world was not unified. It was not the single thread of Homo sapiens stretching forward to us. It was a braided river, many currents running at once, some strong, some shallow, many destined to dry and vanish. We imagine ourselves as inevitable, as though humanity was always meant to be one. But back then, we were many, and the fate of most was extinction. The best known of these early wanderers was Homo erectus. They were taller, stronger, with bodies adapted for distance. They were persistence hunters, chasing antelope and zebra across the savanna until the animals collapsed in exhaustion. Their footprints appear in the volcanic ash of East Africa, in the caves of Georgia, in the islands of Indonesia. No other species of early human had ranged so far, pushing into every corner of the old world. They were the first to leave Africa in great numbers, the first to show what humans could become. Explorers, survivors, restless wanderers, but they were not alone. In Africa, other populations stirred. Some may have been early Homo heidelbergensis, ancestors of both Neanderthals and modern humans. Heavier browed, stockier, they lived in hunting bands that relied on cooperation and strength. They carried wooden spears hardened in fire, evidence of hunts in German lakes and African plains. These hunters knew the rhythm of herds, the paths of rivers, the cycles of seasons. Their survival depended on memory, on passing knowledge from elder to child in gesture and sound. In Asia, things were stranger still. In caves across China, fragments of skulls and teeth speak of humans whose identity is still uncertain, species unnamed, shadows in the fossil record. In the Denisova cave of Siberia, a sliver of bone left evidence of a whole people, the Denisovans, whose genetic echoes live on in us, but whose faces we may never truly know. Asia was a patchwork of human kinds, some mixing, some isolated, all fragile. These early humans were not separated by oceans of difference. They could likely recognize one another, even mate and bear children together. But in daily life, they lived apart, defined by subtle differences in skull shape, body build, and above all by geography. Rivers, mountains, deserts. These were the true walls between peoples. To cross them was to enter another human world, one where the faces looked both familiar and strange. Imagine one band of Homo erectus emerging from the scrubland onto a plain, only to see smoke rising in the distance, another fire, another clan. When they approached, the figures they met looked human enough, upright, tool-using, fire-making. Yet their gestures were unfamiliar, their sounds arranged differently. These were not animals, not predators, but they were not kin either. They were something in between, rivals, competitors, perhaps sometimes enemies. And yet the story was not always one of violence. The bones we find show no great evidence of war. There were likely skirmishes, battles over waterholes or hunting grounds, but there must also have been moments of mingling, curiosity overcoming fear, trading tools or mates, exchanging fragments of knowledge. It is here in these shadowy exchanges that the great story of our species begins, not one lineage, but many weaving together, sometimes colliding, sometimes fusing. The diversity of early humans was astonishing. Some were built for the heat, lean and long-limbed, able to shed warmth as they ran across savannas. Others were broad and heavy, adapted for cold forests and snowy steppes. Some carried wide noses to warm the air they breathed. Others narrow features suited for the tropics. These bodies told the story of adaptation, of evolution unfolding not in laboratories or books, but in the raw struggle for survival. The daily lives of these humans were shaped by their differences. Homo erectus carried simple but effective stone hand axes, tools that could butcher an animal, scrape hides, or split wood. They were the great generalists, their technology unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years, yet powerful enough to sustain them across continents. Other groups, perhaps early Heidelbergensis, experimented with new designs, wooden spears hardened in fire, blades more finely chipped, strategies more specialized. Each lineage tinkered with survival in its own way. Some thrived near rivers and lakes, catching fish and trapping small animals. Others shadowed great predators, waiting until lions or saber-toothed cats had fed before moving in with stone tools to harvest what was left. Scavenging was dangerous, but efficient. A carcass left half-eaten was a treasure, rich with calories that could mean the difference between life and starvation. Others became masters of persistence hunting, chasing game across the open plains until it collapsed, exhausted. Such hunts required stamina, teamwork and knowledge of the land, yet no strategy was permanent. The earth shifted constantly beneath them. Where a river once flowed, a desert could appear within a lifetime. Forests receded into dry scrubland. Cold advanced, bringing glaciers and frozen steppes. When the environment changed, entire ways of life vanished. A clan that had mastered fishing might find itself stranded as lakes dried. A hunting strategy honed for one prey became useless when herds migrated elsewhere. In this world, flexibility was survival. Still, even in their differences, these humans shared something vital: memory. Knowledge did not vanish with the setting sun. It was carried in gestures, in crude sounds, in the teaching of elders to children. A way to sharpen stone, a trail to water, the smell of a poisonous plant. These were lessons that could not be forgotten. For without them, a group might not last another season. For all their strength and adaptation, these humans lived on a razor's edge. Populations were never large. A single drought could wipe out a clan. A single harsh winter could erase an entire valley's people. Even at their height, there were never millions, only tens of thousands, scattered thinly across continents. They were not rulers of the earth, but survivors clinging to its margins. Still, the variety of humanity in this age was staggering. Imagine the earth lit by scattered fires, each tended by a different kind of human. In Africa, lean hunters tracked gazelle across the savannas. In Europe, stockier humans braved cold forests, their fires small shields against endless night. In Asia, strange cousins left bones in caves and teeth in rivers, silent testimonies of lives we can barely glimpse. It was not one species that walked the world, but many threads, many experiments in survival. But diversity is fragile. The same forces that created it could also destroy it. Climate change did not favor one lineage over another. It cut through all, demanding adaptation or death. And when the Great Bottleneck came, it did not discriminate. 99% of these humans, Erectus, Heidelbergensis, Denisovan, and countless unnamed, would be lost. Only a few would remain, isolated and scattered, carrying forward the fire of humanity into a dark age. They did not know this as they hunted, as they chipped stone, as they raised their children by the fire. To them, life was already hard enough. But in those fragile lives, in that diversity, lay the seeds of our story, a story of survival, of loss, of resilience, a story that would soon narrow brutally into almost nothing. And so we leave the panorama of many humans, different, scattered, fragile, and step closer, to see them not as species on a map, but as families, as clans, as people living day by day. What was it like to share food, to build shelter, to watch the sky darken with storm? What was it like to be one of them, before the collapse came? To step into the life of an ancient clan 900,000 years ago is to step into a rhythm of survival, more fragile, more intimate, and more relentless than anything we know today. These clans were small, perhaps 20 to 40 individuals at most, bound together not by abstract law or written word, but by necessity. Kinship was their glue, survival, their purpose, and every breath was woven into the fabric of the group. At dawn, the camp stirred to life. The fire, kept smoldering through the night, was coaxed back into flame with dry grass and careful breath. Fire was not guaranteed. It had to be stolen from lightning or volcanic earth. To let it die was to risk darkness, predators, and cold, and so fire was guarded like a living member of the clan, a fragile ember on which all survival depended. Children played near the edges of the group, imitating their elders with sticks and stones. Even in play they learned the sharpness of flint, the balance of a spear, the warning cries of birds that signaled danger. Every gesture was instruction, every imitation a lesson. There was no school, no formal teaching. Life itself was the teacher, and memory the only book. The hunters prepared for the day's pursuit. Some carried hand axes chipped from stone, their edges gleaming under the rising sun. Others held wooden spears, tips hardened in fire. They painted their bodies with mud or ash, not as art, but as shield against insects and glare. Their eyes scanned the horizon, seeking movement in the tall grass, listening for the distant thunder of hoofs. The gatherers moved differently. Women and elders carried baskets of woven reeds or hides, searching the forest edge for berries, roots, and tubers. They knew the land intimately, which plants nourished, which poisoned, which healed. A misstep could mean death, not only for one but for the whole clan. For food was shared, always shared. The spoils of hunter and gatherer divided among all. Without sharing, the clan fractured. Without the clan, none could survive. At night the rhythm shifted. Around the fire, voices rose, not yet language as we know it, but sounds, chants, cries. The firelight flickered on faces as stories were gestured and half-spoken. The hunt retold, the storm remembered, the predator imitated with growls and leaps. Children's eyes widened in the glow, absorbing the lore of survival. Firelight was not only warmth, it was memory, it was culture, it was the fragile spark of humanity itself. Life in these clans was fragile, but it was also astonishingly cooperative. Every member mattered. The young could not yet hunt, the old could not chase, but both had roles that ensured the survival of all. Elders carried memory, the trails to water, the seasons of migration, the warning signs of drought. Children carried promise, learning through imitation, storing in their minds the knowledge that would someday replace the fading voices of their parents. Gender roles, though fluid, were shaped by necessity. Men often hunted, their bodies tuned for long chases across the savanna. Women gathered roots, fruits and seeds, their expertise in plants often providing more reliable calories than the uncertain kill of the hunt. But these roles were not rigid, necessity bent them. A woman might throw a spear if danger struck. A man might forage when the hunt failed. Survival did not allow for dogma. It demanded flexibility, and every hand contributed. Cooperation was everything. When a hunt succeeded, the carcass was dragged back to camp, and all ate together. Meat was shared, marrow cracked from bones, hide scraped for clothing and shelter. To hoard was dangerous, a violation of the bond that held the group. Sharing was not generosity, it was survival. Without it, the clan fractured, and fracture meant death. Rituals grew from this cooperation. After a kill, the hunters might circle the fire, imitating the animal, chanting its final cries, honoring the struggle. These were not yet religions, not yet gods, but shadows of belief, the sense that life was more than flesh, that the hunt carried meaning beyond the meal. The sparks of spirituality flickered in those nights, blending fear, gratitude, and awe into something timeless. Predators were constant. Lions prowled the grasslands, leopards stalked from trees, hyenas laughed in the dark. But the greatest danger was not tooth or claw, it was scarcity. A dry season that stretched too long, a herd that migrated too far, a storm that flooded caves. In such times, clans broke apart, wandered, starved. Mortality was woven into every day. Few lived past 30, many died before reaching 10, and yet, in their short, brutal lives, they endured enough to pass life forward. They did not see themselves as fragile. To them, they were strong, the only ones who could chip stone, who could tame fire, who could share meaning in sound and gesture. Around their fires, they were kings of their small world, even as the earth prepared to test them with a storm of extinction they could not foresee. To survive as a clan was not only to share food and fire, but to share burden. In the bones and shelters they left behind, we see traces of something remarkable: care. When a hunter broke a leg, he was not abandoned. His bones show healing, proof that others carried him, fed him, tended his wounds until he could walk again. When a child was sick, mothers and fathers watched over them, even when resources were scarce. This was more than instinct, it was compassion, the first flicker of what would later become culture, morality, even love. Death was a constant presence. Children died in infancy, mothers in childbirth, hunters in hunts. Predators struck without warning. Sickness carried lives away in days. Yet, in the shadows of death, we glimpse rituals of farewell. Bodies placed carefully in caves, perhaps covered with stone or earth, perhaps accompanied by tools or food. These burials were not yet religion as we know it, but they were acts of memory, acknowledgements that the dead were still part of the clan's story. Grief bound them as much as joy. A death was not the loss of one, but of a role, a voice, a memory. Elders who passed took with them maps of rivers, knowledge of seasons, recipes for survival. To lose them was to lose more than a life. It was to lose centuries of memory. And so every effort was made to keep the old alive, even when their bodies weakened. They were walking libraries, and their disappearance could doom the clan. Around the fire, bonds deepened. Children clung to mothers and fathers. Hunters leaned against one another after long chases. Elders sat wrapped in furs, eyes reflecting flame. There was laughter, rough, simple but real. There were games, contests of strength, mimicry of animals. These moments remind us, they were not only survivors, they were people. They felt pride, sorrow, fear, and joy. Their lives were short, but they were lived fully. Every night, as the stars burned above, and predators howled in the distance, the clan gathered close. Firelight painted their faces with gold and shadow, each face etched with resilience. In that circle, they were not prey, not scattered individuals. They were something new on the earth, creatures bound by meaning, by memory, by bonds deeper than instinct. And though they did not know it, those bonds would be the only reason their line would endure when almost all others were erased. As the seasons turned, life in the clan followed its rhythm of fragility and strength. They hunted when prey was near, they foraged when the land was kind, they huddled together when storms lashed or predators prowled. In their world there was no certainty, only the immediate. Yet for hundreds of thousands of years that rhythm held. There were times of plenty. Herds gathered thick on the plains, rains returned to rivers, fruit swelled heavy on trees. In such moments, the clan thrived. Children grew stronger, elders lived longer, tools became sharper, fire more constant. These brief golden ages gave the illusion that survival was secure, that the world would continue as it had, fragile but endurable. But beneath that illusion, the earth was shifting. The climate was not a backdrop, but a restless force. Ice advanced from the north, deserts spread in the south, storms swept across coasts. The balance that sustained clans was always fragile, always one failed season away from collapse. They could not see the scale of what was coming, the long winters, the choking droughts, the ages of hunger that would grind humanity down to almost nothing. And yet, as they sat around the fire, as sparks rose into the dark, they must have felt something in their bones, the precariousness of it all, the weight of survival, hanging by a thread. Their lives were fierce, their bonds unbreakable, their courage undeniable. But the storm that approached was greater than courage, greater than any single clan, greater even than the many species of human that walked the earth. The illusion of abundance would soon shatter, and when it did, the world would take nearly all of them. In scattered corners of the ancient world, life sometimes felt stable. Herds moved in predictable rhythms, waterholes stayed full through the seasons, forests bore fruit, year after year. To the clans who lived in such places, it must have seemed as though the struggle had been conquered, as if the world had finally allowed them a margin of comfort. Children played freely, hunters returned with meat, the fires burned not only for survival, but for song. Abundance gave birth to confidence. Where hunger had once stalked every day, now there were moments of laughter, moments where the burden of survival felt lighter. The clans made tools more carefully, tested new edges of stone, shaped spears with patience instead of desperation. Around the fire, stories lengthened, gestures grew more elaborate, memory grew thicker with detail. For a flicker of time, life seemed expansive, but this abundance was a mask. The Earth's climate was already tilting toward instability. Rains shifted, glacial ice pressed southward, temperatures dropped and rose in violent cycles. The fertile lands shrank, the herds wandered further, the rivers grew unreliable. What looked like stability was only the pause before a stop. When food was plentiful, clans expanded, children survived in greater numbers, groups grew larger, fires dotted the landscape more thickly. But growth carried a hidden price: more mouths to feed, more competition for prey, more pressure on fragile ecosystems. In times of plenty, humanity spread thin across the land, leaving itself vulnerable for the moment when the earth turned against them, and turned. It would. The cycles of ice and drought were merciless, indifferent to the fragile victories of human clans. The abundance they had known, the brief illusion of safety, collapsed swiftly. Herds that had once crowded valleys vanished, driven north or south by changing climate. Rivers dried, forests thinned, storms scoured the land. Clans who had grown fat on good years faced hunger deeper than they had ever known. What made this age so tragic was the false promise of its golden moments. Survival had always been fragile, but now the collapse was absolute. The clans who had once thrived were broken, scattered, starved. Diversity had filled the world, many species, many strategies, many fires in them. But the storm cut through them all. It did not matter who ran the fastest, who chipped the sharpest blade, who told the richest story. 99% of humanity would not endure. The illusion of abundance became the memory of loss. The fires that once dotted the plains went dark, one by one. The world grew quieter. Predators prowled where clans had once hunted. Rivers flowed without human footprints. Caves stood empty. Humanity had been reduced to fragments, surviving only in hidden refuges, carrying the last spark of a story that had nearly ended before it had begun. And yet, some endured. In a handful of valleys, in caves tucked against mountains, by rivers that still flowed, small groups clung to life. They did not know they were the last. They did not know that almost all of humanity had already been erased. They only knew that survival had narrowed to its most brutal essence. One more hunt, one more fight, one more night alive. The fragile illusion of abundance was gone, shattered forever.
The age of plenty had ended in silence, but within that silence, the few who endured carried something greater than themselves, the seed of all who would follow. The storm had come, and humanity had nearly ended, but not quite. The line held, thin as a thread, glowing faintly in the dark, and from that thread, the story of us would continue.
The first signs of descent did not roar like thunder. They crept, slow and quiet, across the land. 900,000 years ago, the climate was not steady. It was a restless tide. For millennia, clans of humans had learned to live within its rhythm, enduring drought and flood, cold and warmth. But now the cycle shifted toward severity, toward instability, unlike anything their ancestors had known. At first, it must have seemed like any other change. Rains grew weaker, grasslands turned brittle, rivers thinned into shallow veins. Herds that once thundered across the plains grew sparse, moving farther each season in search of pasture. The skies dimmed under clouds of dust. Winds carried the taste of dryness. For a time, clans adjusted. They had always adjusted. They gathered more roots, hunted smaller animals, pushed farther with each migration. To them, this was survival as usual, but beneath the surface, the world was unraveling. What had once been gradual became erratic. Years of drought followed years of flood. Winters stretched longer, summers scorched hotter, glaciers crawled southward, seas receded, deserts spread like fire. Landscapes that had supported life for centuries shifted in a single lifetime, leaving humans stranded in places that no longer sustained them. For small clans, there was no margin. One poor season meant hunger, two meant collapse. Families watched as children weakened, elders faded, hunters returned empty-handed. The fire still burned, but around it the bodies grew thinner, the silences longer. They could not know it, but the planet itself was entering one of its most brutal climatic experiments, a long ice age cycle that would last hundreds of thousands of years. For humanity, it would mean not just hardship, but annihilation. 99% of their kind would not see its end. The disasters did not arrive in a single blow. They unfolded like a cruel rhythm, each season carrying new trials. In one decade, rain would pour in endless torrents, swelling rivers into floods that swept away shelters and drowned hunting grounds. The clans fled to higher ground, only to return years later to find the valleys cracked and empty, rivers reduced to threads of mud. Droughts were the most merciless. They lingered not for weeks but for years. Grass shriveled, roots dried, animals migrated farther and farther until the plains lay silent. For a hunting band, this silence was death. No hooves to track, no carcasses to scavenge, no sign of life but the circling vultures above. In these times, humans became desperate gatherers, scraping bark, digging for insects, chewing bitter plants that barely filled the stomach. Storms came too, violent and sudden. Winds tore across open land, lightning split trees, and rain hammered the earth into rivers of mud. Fires sparked by lightning might consume the last dry shelters. Children clung to their parents as thunder rolled, as the night itself seemed to collapse. And then there was the cold. Glaciers crept forward, vast walls of ice grinding across the land, crushing forests, remaking valleys. Winters lengthened, snow fell where it had never fallen, frost crept into caves, winds sliced through hides and furs. Hunters set out and did not return, their bodies claimed by storms or hunger. For humans who had no written memory, these changes must have seemed like wrath itself, the world shifting against them, a force too vast to fight, too indifferent to plead with. All they could do was endure, season by season, storm by storm, yet endurance had limits. Faced with these shifts, the clans had only two choices: adapt or perish. Many did not succeed. Their fires went out, their bones left scattered in caves or buried in shifting earth. But some adapted, pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be human. Tools became more than instruments. They became lifelines. The hand axe, once crude, was refined. Hunters learned to strike flakes from stone in sharper, more deliberate ways. A better edge meant meat carved faster before predators arrived. Hides scraped cleaner for clothing against the cold. Wooden spears, hardened in fire, became longer, sturdier, capable of piercing through the thick hides of great beasts. These weapons were not just survival tools, they were answers to a world that was closing its jaws around them. Fire, too, became essential. Where once it was stolen from lightning and guarded with reverence, now it was a necessity for survival in frozen nights. Clans that mastered the art of keeping fire alive thrived longer than those who let it die. Some may have even learned to kindle it, striking stone against stone to summon sparks. A skill like this could mean the difference between life and extinction. Social bonds grew tighter. In harsh winters, hunters shared not only food but warmth. Bodies huddled close in caves lined with furs. Cooperation deepened. Without it, no clan could survive the long hunger. The sharing of memory became sacred. Elders passed on knowledge of migration routes, of plants that healed, of shelters hidden in the land. Children became apprentices in survival, learning to shape stone, to read tracks, to smell rain before it fell. But for all their resilience, the changes were unrelenting. Innovation delayed death, but it did not stop it. Many clans vanished, their adaptations too slow, their numbers too small, their luck too thin. The climate did not relent. It demanded more than survival. It demanded transformation. The world that once sustained them was becoming unrecognizable. Valleys that had echoed with the thunder of herds lay empty. Rivers that had fed generations shrank into cracked beds of dust. Forests thinned into barren scrubland, and the winds carried only the sound of desolation. For the clans, every year was now a gamble. Some gambles were lost. Groups who lingered too long in failing lands disappeared. Their fires left no smoke, their shelters no trace, their voices swallowed by the silence of extinction. Others pushed forward, searching for better ground, only to find new storms, new deserts, new enemies. The earth was closing in, stripping away the margins of survival, until only the hardest, the luckiest remained. In this crucible of change, humanity was tempered but also thinned. Where once there had been many, now there were fewer. The abundance of species and strategies began to collapse, pressed under the relentless weight of a planet in turmoil. The signs were everywhere. Fewer tools in the archaeological record, fewer bones in caves, fewer footprints in ash. It was as if the earth itself was erasing them, reducing their presence to a faint whisper. And yet for those who survived, endurance became identity. They were not just hunters or gatherers. They were wanderers, driven by necessity to follow herds, to chase rivers, to cross mountains. They could no longer remain in one place. The land would not allow it. Movement was life, and soon migration would become the only path left open. The slow descent had begun. What was once adaptation was now desperation. The clans who endured would be forced to abandon the lands of their ancestors, carrying with them only fire, tools, and memory. Their journey was no longer a choice, but a demand carved by the earth itself. And with each step into the unknown, they walked deeper into the bottleneck that would nearly erase them from the world. When the earth turned hostile, when rivers dried and grasslands vanished, the clans had no choice but to move. Migration was not new to humans. They had always followed herds, always shifted with the seasons. But now migration was no longer rhythm, it was survival. Entire valleys were abandoned, ancestral caves left cold, trails worn smooth by generations, erased under advancing ice or engulfed by spreading deserts. The first migrations must have carried both hope and terror. To leave familiar land was to leave behind memory itself, the knowledge of which streams ran sweet, which plants healed, where predators waited. Elders knew the old ways, but those ways no longer applied. Each step into new territory was a step into ignorance. Every hill might hide danger. Every forest knew predators. Clans pushed outward in every direction. Some followed retreating herds northward, chasing mammoth and bison into colder lands. Others drifted toward shrinking coasts, scavenging fish and shellfish as they retreated before rising tides. Some wandered into forests where the canopy darkened the sky. Others into deserts where water was a dream. For many, migration was a slow death, families thinning, one by one until only silence remained. But movement also created encounters. Where one clan fled, another had already arrived. In narrow valleys or fertile plains, bands of humans met face to face, their fires glowing in the same darkness. These were meetings charged with tension. To share land was to share food, and food was never enough. Rivalry flared easily. Sometimes they watched each other from a distance, suspicion in every glance. Sometimes they fought, stones hurled, spears thrust, blood spilled. And yet, Not every meeting was war. There were moments of exchange, fragile truces where tools or mates passed between clans. A new stone flaking technique might spread in this way. A sharper blade carried from one fire to another. Knowledge flowed along these migrations like hidden rivers. Even as populations dwindled, humanity was splintered, but still, threads of connection wove between the fragments. The journeys were long measured, not in days or weeks but in lifetimes. A clan might move only a few miles in a season, searching for waterholes that no longer existed, chasing the fading tracks of herds that had gone beyond the horizon. To them, the world must have felt infinite, a shifting labyrinth, where every familiar landmark was erased by climate's hand. Exhaustion became their companion. Hunters returned with blistered feet and empty hands. Mothers carried children across barren ground, feeding them only what roots could be dug from the dust. Elders struggled to keep pace, leaning on sticks, their memories of fertile lands now bitter stories that mocked the present. For every clan that moved forward, another fell behind, extinguished in silence. And when clans met upon these desperate paths, the air itself thickened with danger. To see another fire at night meant choice, approach or flee. Curiosity battled fear, but hunger often tipped the balance toward violence. A rival clan was not just competition for food, it was mouths that might consume the last of what the land could give. Spears were raised not in hatred, but in necessity. The clashes were brief, brutal, and decisive. A raid at dawn, a sudden ambush by a riverbank, stones flying in the dark. Victors claimed the land, the fire, sometimes even the surviving members of the defeated clan. Losers vanished, their voices lost in the wind. And yet, even in these violent exchanges, humanity endured. The merging of captives, the mingling of families, ensured that genes, stories, and knowledge survived even when clans did not. Not all encounters were bloody. In some rare moments, necessity carved a fragile peace. A clan might approach with hands empty, offering stone or shell as trade. A wounded hunter might be spared, his skill later shared. In times of desperate scarcity, even rivals recognized that survival could mean cooperation. These alliances were fleeting, as fragile as the seasons, but in them we see the first faint sparks of diplomacy, the instinct to negotiate rather than destroy. Still, such moments were rare. For most, the migrations were marked by loss. Every step forward was shadowed by those who fell behind, those who vanished, those whose fires never burned again. The great journeys did not reshape only the land humans walked, they reshaped the humans themselves. Migration was not simply movement, it was transformation. The body bent under its demands, the mind stretched to meet new challenges, and culture itself grew out of the long road. Endurance became humanity's greatest weapon. Children grew up walking, their legs hardening across endless plains. Hunters learned to chase prey across days, not hours, their lungs and hearts adapting to rhythms of pursuit that no predator could match. The weak fell away, but those who survived carried bodies shaped for distance, for resilience. Migration was a sieve, and only the strong, the adaptive, passed through it. But more than bodies, it was minds that evolved on these marches. To survive in new lands demanded foresight. Hunters learned to read the patterns of wind and sky, to predict where animals would move, when storms would strike, where rivers might still flow. Memory was no longer enough. Imagination became vital. To leave one valley for another, unseen, required belief in possibility, in futures not yet real. That spark of imagination, the ability to plan beyond the present, was lit by migration's hardships. Culture deepened on the road, stories lengthened, carried from camp to camp, weaving lessons into memory. A tale of hunger became warning, a tale of a successful hunt became instruction. Songs, chants, and gestures stitched clans together, reminding them of who they were when the land itself seemed determined to erase them. Fire became not only warmth but symbol, a moving hearth carried from one world to the next, binding generations with a sense of continuity. In a life of ceaseless change, even tools carried memory across landscapes. A sharper blade learned in one valley was carried into the next, copied by new hands, spreading innovations along invisible networks of migration. Knowledge traveled farther than any single clan, threading humanity together. Even as populations splintered, each step across the earth was not just survival, it was invention, adaptation, creation. And yet,
Every gain was shadowed by loss, families fractured, some clans disappeared entirely, leaving no trace but stone flakes buried in abandoned camps. Others survived but diminished, carrying forward only fragments of their old lives. Migration demanded sacrifice, and most of humanity paid the price. By the end of these migrations, the world of early humans had changed forever. What had once been scattered fires in familiar valleys were now thin threads stretched across vast and hostile landscapes. The clans that survived were no longer simply hunters and gatherers. They were wanderers without anchor, their identity forged in movement itself. But survival on the road was never secure. The further they traveled, the more the earth tested them. Ice advanced in the north, deserts swallowed land in the south, storms lashed coastlines, and mountains loomed like walls. Each barrier demanded a choice: risk the crossing or turn back into hunger. Many chose wrong. Entire families perished in the gamble, their bones left in deserts, their tools lost in caves swallowed by frost. The survivors carried more than scars. They carried the knowledge that the world was not theirs, but something they must continually chase, beg, and wrestle with. Hope flickered in them, for to walk was to hope that somewhere ahead lay water, prey, shelter. But each step also reminded them that they were fragile, small creatures in a vast indifferent world. And so, migration itself became a crucible. It forged stronger bodies, sharper tools, deeper memories. It created resilience unmatched in the animal kingdom, but it also thinned their numbers, burned away the weak, erased entire lineages. Diversity narrowed with every mile, every storm, every lost fire. They did not know it, but they were being pushed toward the edge of a cliff. The road they walked, though filled with invention and endurance, was leading them not to prosperity, but to a bottleneck so narrow it would erase nearly all of them. Migration had kept them alive, but it had also carried them into the heart of collapse. The slow descent was accelerating. Ahead lay scarcity, deeper than any they had yet faced, and hunger so profound it would silence almost every fire. Hunger was the constant shadow that walked beside humanity. It haunted every step of migration, whispered at every fire, lingered in the eyes of children. For a time movement kept it at bay. New valleys offered prey, new rivers offered fish, new forests offered fruit. But the longer the climate spiraled, the fewer refuges remained. The world itself seemed to turn against them. When herds vanished, the silence was unbearable. Once the thunder of hoofs had rolled across plains, a promise of food if only the hunt succeeded. Now grasslands would meet, but with hollow faces, their too useless without prey. Mothers searched for roots that no longer grew, for berries that had withered, for insects hiding in soil too dry to dig. Fires, not with abundance but with desperation, their smoke carrying the scent of hunger. Clans grew thin, children weakened first, their cries faded into silence. Small bodies wrapped in heights, laid gently in shallow earth. Elders followed, their wisdom extinguished with their breath, their memories lost forever. Even hunters, once the strong pillars of the clan, began to falter, their strength consumed by endless days of running on empty stomachs. In the face of his choices turned brutal. A wounded hunter might no longer be carried, but left behind. A mother might eat less so her child could eat more, knowing she would not see another season. Fires that once drew clans together now flickered over smaller circles, smaller families, smaller fragments of humanity. The bonds of cooperation strained under the weight of starvation. Scarcity was not a passing season, it was the new law of the earth. And under its rule, humanity began to collapse. The signs of collapse were everywhere. Valleys once alive with smoke from many fires, now lay dark. Caves that had sheltered families echoed only with the drip of water. The land itself seemed empty, as if the earth had decided that humans were no longer part of its design. Starvation carved itself into the bodies of the survivors. Ribs pressed against skin, limbs grew thin and brittle, eyes sank into hollow sockets, voices lost their strength. The proud hunters, who once chased antelope across the plains, now stumbled after rabbits, after rats, after anything that could be caught. Children chewed bark and roots too bitter to swallow, gagging on the only food left. Some clans turned to desperate measures. Bones found in ancient caves that speak of cannibalism, not ritual, not cruelty, but hunger so profound that even kinship was broken.
To survive another night, the unthinkable was done. In such acts we see the depth of the collapse, the stripping away of humanity's bonds by the weight of necessity. Conflicts grew sharper, scarcity sharpened rivalry like a blade. Where once clans might have traded or coexisted uneasily, now they attacked without hesitation. A rival group was not just competition, it was a threat to survival itself. Spears flew in the dark, fires were stolen, families scattered. The world of humans grew smaller, each surviving clan and island besieged by both the earth and their own kind. But even violence could not halt the decline. Killing rival did not conjure food, it only thinned humanity further. Every conflict left fewer survivors, fewer children, fewer voices. It was as if humanity was devouring itself, unable to endure the crushing hand of a planet grown hostile. And through it all, hunger remained, gnawing relentless, a shadow that no weapon could kill. The collapse did not strike in one sudden blow. It stretched across centuries, grinding humanity down like stone under ice. Each generation lived through hunger, and each left fewer survivors behind. By the height of the crisis, humanity's numbers had dwindled to an almost unimaginable low. Genetic evidence today tells the story. Where there may have once been hundreds of thousands, there were reduced to a few thousand breeding individuals, scattered across vast continents. Imagine the silence of such a world, where once dozens of fires burned in a valley, perhaps one remained, where once the calls of many hunters echoed in the plains. Now there was only wind. A child grew up to Nemo, seeing another clan beyond their own, never knowing if others like them still walked the earth. The loneliness of survival was as crushing as hunger itself. Entire lineages vanished. Some species, cousins of Homo erectus or early Heidelbergensis, disappeared without trace. Their bones tell us they once lived, but their voices are gone forever. The diversity of humans that once filled the earth narrowed, bottlenecked into a fragile handful of survivors. 99% of humanity erased. This was not extinction, but it was the difference was measured in threads. A few valleys where water still flowed, a few bands of hunters who managed to find prey, a few caves where fire burned through the long winters. Humanity, hung on by fingernails, survived not through strength, but through sheer persistence. And yet, in those few survivors lay the seed of everything to come. Every human alive today descends from those who endured that silence, those who refused to let the last embers die. What remained of humanity was not triumphant, it was fragile. Fires flickered in caves where families huddled close, their numbers so few that every child born carried the weight of the spirit. Each death was more than a loss. It was a gamble against extinction. A single illness could wipe out an entire band. A single failed season could end a lineage forever. And yet, they endured, against drought, against ice, against predators and despair. A handful of clans held on. They had no sense of destiny, no vision of the future. Their lives were not stories of survival to them. They were simply the struggle of one day to the next. But in that struggle lay the turning point of history. The collapse had stripped humanity bare. No longer were many species scattered across continents. No longer were there countless clans to fill valleys with fire and song. There were only fragments, whispers, shadows of what once was. Humanity was revealed for what it truly was. Fragile, breakable, vulnerable to the forces of earth and sky. And yet, in that fragility was something more enduring. Resilience, cooperation, memory. These invisible tools allowed the last survivors to withstand what they carried the fire through the storm, and because of them, we exist. The age of scarcity had not ended, but humanity had reached its lowest ebb. Its numbers narrowed to the edge of nothing. Ahead lay the question that would define them. Could they rebuild, or would the silence claim them at last? In the end, the greatest revelation of this long descent was not strength but fragility. Humanity had always lived close to the edge, but now the edge was clear, sharp and merciless. 99% of their kind had vanished. Diversity was erased, voices silenced, fires extinguished. What remained was a faint scattering of clans, their survival no more certain than the sparks that leapt from their fires into the night. The bottleneck was not yet fully closed, but its shadow had fallen. The survivors were so few that each clan, each family became critical to the future of the species. One birth could mean the continuation of a lineage, one death could mean its end forever. The margin of existence had narrowed to the smallest possible thread. Life in these fragments was stripped down to essentials. Every hunt was life or death.
Every shelter was a fortress against extinction. Cooperation was no longer optional. It was the only path forward. Without sharing, without trust, without the fragile bonds of kinship, humanity would have ended here, in the silence of an uncaring earth. They had no way of knowing that they stood at the brink of disappearance. To them, this was simply life, the constant struggle against hunger, cold and fear. But in truth, they were living through one of the most decisive chapters in human history, the moment when our species nearly ended before it truly began. The last survivors were not the strongest hunters, nor the fiercest fighters. They were the ones who learned, who shared, who endured together. In their tiny groups, the seeds of resilience took root. A clan could no longer afford arrogance. The hunter who hoarded meat doomed his kin as surely as a predator's jaws. Sharing became law, not written, not spoken, but carved into survival itself. To give food was to give life. To withhold it was to betray the future. Innovation became instinct. The smallest change, a sharper edge on stone, a better way to trap fish, a sturdier shelter against wind, could tip the balance between life and extinction. These humans lived in a crucible where failure was erased instantly. What survived, what worked, was carried forward, repeated, taught. In this way, culture itself was forged not in comfort but in fire. And there was resilience of spirit. When children were born, their cries were more than sound. They were victory, proof that life still dared to continue. When the dead were buried or laid to rest, the act was more than grief. It was a promise that memory would not die, that even in the smallest clan humanity was more than hunger and fear. They endured not because the world was kind, but because they refused to surrender. And that refusal, repeated night after night, season after season, was enough to hold back extinction. The earth had tested them, and nearly broken them. In this crucible of scarcity, humanity's fragility was laid bare. Yet at the same time, the foundations of our survival were being tempered. The survivors were not numerous, but they were resilient, bound together by cooperation, sharpened by necessity, hardened by centuries of hunger and fear. From this thinning came clarity. No longer could clans rely on abundance, on vast herds or fertile valleys. They had to invent, to imagine, to push beyond instinct. The very traits that would one day define humanity, creativity, foresight, memory, were forced into being by the brutality of the earth. Still, the cost was staggering. 99% of their kind were gone. Entire lineages had vanished. Whole species of humans erased. The firelight of diversity that once dotted the continents was now reduced to a handful of embers, glowing faintly against the dark. Humanity had been reduced to almost nothing, and yet within this near nothing lay everything. The survivors carried forward not only their bodies, but the potential of all who would follow. Every human alive today carries their legacy. Every word we speak, every story we tell, is an echo of the few who endured. The descent had revealed the truth. We were fragile, more fragile than we could imagine, but fragility was not the end. Fragility, when bound to resilience, became endurance. The world had stripped humanity bare. The abundance of the past was gone, the many voices of our kin silenced. What remained was a thread so thin, it might have snapped at any moment. A failed hunt, a bitter winter, a sickness spreading through a single clan. Any of these could have been enough to erase us forever. And yet against all odds, the line held. A few clans guarded their fires, passed their tools, taught their children, whispered their memories. They did not know they were the last. They did not know that the fate of a species rested on their fragile survival. To them they were simply enduring another night, another season, another storm. But to us, looking back, their endurance was the hinge of history. The slow descent had revealed the truth. Humanity was not inevitable. We could have been erased, forgotten, lost to time like so many others. Our survival was not the triumph of strength, but the stubbornness of a few fragile groups who refused to let the fire die. Ahead lay the bottleneck, a trial greater still, where the very existence of humanity would be narrowed to almost nothing. From that darkness, the survivors would emerge, not unchanged, but forged into something new. The descent was over, the bottleneck awaited.
900,000 years ago, the Earth itself became an adversary. What had once been a cycle of hardship and recovery hardened into an age of relentless severity. Ice advanced from the poles in vast white walls, glaciers grinding across continents, swallowing valleys and forests. In the south, deserts expanded, rivers failed, and fertile land shriveled into wasteland. The climate no longer shifted in gentle rhythms. It lunged, violent and unpredictable, reshaping the world in decades instead of millennia. For humanity, scattered and fragile, this was disaster. Herds that had once fed them vanished into unreachable regions or perished in the cold. Plants withered before their roots could be dug. The air itself grew harsher. Biting winds scoured the skin. Storms broke shelters apart. Nights froze breath into crystal. The earth offered no sanctuary. Clans that had survived for generations began to collapse. Hunters returned with nothing, their tools clutched in empty hands. Children cried with hollow voices, their ribs pressing against thin skin. Fires, once symbols of endurance, now burned over circles of the dying. For the first time, survival no longer felt like struggle. It felt like defeat. The catastrophe was not local. It was global. From Africa to Eurasia, every corner of the human world was struck. The great expansion of early humans, their exploration across continents, was reversed. The map of humanity shrank with every passing season, their presence erased from valley after valley, until only a handful of regions still supported life. They did not know the word extinction, but they lived in its shadow. Around their fires, they must have felt it in their bones, the sense that they were becoming fewer, that the world was swallowing them. For the first time in history, humanity stood not at the edge of survival, but at the edge of disappearance. The disasters came in cycles, cruel and unrelenting. Years of crushing drought gave way to years of flood, each as deadly as the other. In some regions, the skies withheld rain for so long that the ground cracked into a mosaic of dust. Streams disappeared. Trees stood as skeletons, stripped of leaves, their roots clawing at barren soil. Animals fell where they stood, their bones bleaching under a pitiless sun. When the rains returned, they came not as relief but as ruin. Storms tore across the land, rivers swelled beyond their banks, and fertile valleys became torrents of mud. Shelters were swept away, children clung to their mothers, as the earth itself seemed to dissolve beneath their feet. In the north, glaciers expanded. Ice did not move quickly, but it moved with certainty, grinding across mountains and plains, erasing everything in its path. Cold winds swept far beyond the glaciers themselves, turning once livable lands into frozen wastelands. Snow fell where no human had ever seen snow before, blanketing the earth in silence and hunger. The clans could not predict these changes, only endure them. But endurance had limits. The cycles of drought, flood and ice struck faster than humans could adapt. Each time they began to recover, the world shifted again. There was no rhythm, no stability, no reprieve. Children died first. Their small bodies could not endure weeks without food. Elders followed, their frail forms unable to weather the endless marches in search of water. Even hunters, hardened by a lifetime of struggle, fell to exhaustion. Entire families disappeared, leaving behind only scattered tools, footprints in drying mud, and the fading glow of fires that no longer burned. What had once been survival now felt like siege. The earth itself was the enemy, and it was winning. As the world grew harsher, humanity's range began to shrink. Lands that had once been hunting grounds became deserts or ice fields, too barren or too hostile to sustain life. Whole regions that had echoed with human voices fell silent. Step by step, season by season, the map of humanity contracted. Survival became possible only in narrow refuges, valleys where rivers still trickled, caves shielded from the wind, coastal edges where the sea offered fish and shellfish. These were rare sanctuaries, scattered like islands across a hostile world. Clans that found them clung to life, but those who wandered outside them faced near certain death. Isolation deepened. Where once there had been encounters between clans, trade, rivalry, intermarriage, now there was only distance. Vast stretches of unlivable land separated survivors from one another. A family might live and die without ever knowing if others still existed. The sense of being alone on Earth must have grown heavy, pressing down like the weight of the glaciers themselves. Even within these refuges, life was fragile, resources were limited, competition fierce. If a river dried or fish stocks dwindled, an entire clan might vanish in a single season. Every decision mattered: when to hunt, where to settle, when to move. A mistake could cost not just lives, but the entire lineage, and all the while the climate shifted still. Ice advanced and retreated, rains came and failed. The sanctuaries themselves were unstable, offering no guarantee of permanence. The world allowed humanity to exist only in fragments, scattering their firelight into a few flickering points against the vast darkness of extinction. The catastrophe was no longer something to be endured for a season or even a lifetime. It had become the defining reality of the age, a global crucible that would determine whether humanity continued at all. By the height of the catastrophe, humanity was reduced to a handful of scattered lights against a vast and hostile planet. Fires still burned, but fewer with each passing century. Where once whole regions of Africa and Eurasia had echoed with voices, now only silence remained. The catastrophe had revealed the truth. Survival was not guaranteed. No matter how skilled the hunters, no matter how clever the tools, no matter how deep the memories of elders, the earth could erase them all. Droughts, floods, and ice were merciless forces, caring nothing for human struggle. And yet the survivors endured. Against the crushing weight of climate, they clung to life in hidden pockets, feeding from rivers that still trickled, from coasts that still yielded shellfish, from forests that still sheltered game. Their numbers were few, their margin thin, but their determination was fierce. They could not have known that they were living through the great trial of their kind, the bottleneck that would erase 99% of humanity. To them there was only the daily fight to keep the fire alive, to find one more meal, to protect one more child. The climate catastrophe had done its work. Humanity was broken, scattered, reduced to fragments. The next chapter would reveal just how deep that reduction would go, how close our species came to being, nothing more than a memory written in stone. The great collapse was not measured in days or years, it was measured in silence. Fires that once dotted the earth went dark one after another, leaving no trace but ash scattered by wind. Where once there were many, now there were few. Humanity had not vanished, but it had been reduced to its barest thread. Genetic evidence tells us today what the survivors could not have known then. At the height of this bottleneck, there may have been as few as a few thousand breeding individuals left on the entire planet. Imagine it, a species spread across continents reduced to a population smaller than a single modern village. Every death carried the weight of extinction. Every birth was a triumph against oblivion. The reduction was not gentle, it was brutal, merciless. Whole lineages disappeared. Species of human that had thrived for hundreds of thousands of years were erased in a matter of generations. Their bones lie in caves, their tools scattered in the dust, their names unknown because no one lived to remember them. They are the silenced branches of our family tree. For the survivors, the world felt emptier. Valleys that had once echoed with rival clans now held only wind. Forests that once hid other fires now stood silent. To walk the earth was to feel alone, to wonder if any others still lived beyond the horizon. Humanity had become not a chorus but a whisper, yet even in this reduction, the essence of humanity endured. Small groups clung to life, stubbornly refusing to let the fire die. They were fewer than ever before, but they carried with them the legacy of all who had come before. In their hands, in their memories, in their fragile survival, the future of our species was held. In such small numbers, life itself became precarious in ways beyond hunger and cold. A clan might consist of only a handful of families. If sickness struck, it could erase them entirely. If a predator raided the camp, or a storm tore through the shelter, there was no larger population to absorb the loss. Survival balanced on the edge of every accident. Genetics too were narrowed. With so few people, every child born carried a larger portion of humanity's future. The diversity of the species shrank. Entire lineages of traits and variations extinguished forever. From this reduction, our shared ancestry was sealed. All modern humans descend from these few survivors. We are the echo of their endurance, the proof that their thread, though fragile, did not break. Social bonds grew tighter, for they had to. In a larger world, a clan might have split, rival groups might have competed, but now splitting was death. Division could not be afforded. Families bound themselves together with unbreakable trust, for without it, they would not last another season. Culture, too, was reshaped by this reduction. The stories, gestures, and sounds passed around the fire became more precious than ever before. a lesson about where water could be found, a memory of a safe valley, a method of shaping stone. These were treasures of survival. If an elder died before teaching them, they were lost forever. Knowledge was as fragile as the bodies that carried it. The world outside may have been vast, but humanity within it was reduced to islands of survival. Each clan became a world unto itself, carrying forward a fragment of humanity's memory. The earth had nearly erased us, and what remained was small but not yet gone. Isolation weighed as heavily as hunger. For the clans that survived, the world must have felt almost empty. Days and weeks passed without a single sign of another human being. Children could grow to adulthood without ever seeing a face beyond their own family. To live in such silence was to carry the constant question, are we the last? Loneliness shaped them as much as the climate did. Encounters with other humans, once common in the days of abundance, became rare and unpredictable. When two clans stumbled upon one another, the moment was charged with fear. Were these strangers friends, enemies, or ghosts of their own reflection? A decision made in those first seconds could determine the fate of an entire group. Sometimes violence erupted, spears raised, stones thrown, one clan wiped out by another in the desperate struggle for resources. In such moments, humanity devoured itself, reducing its numbers even further. Yet not all encounters ended in blood. On rare occasions, survival demanded unity. Families merged, mates were exchanged, knowledge was shared. These fragile alliances carried human diversity forward, binding together lineages that might otherwise have perished. The fear of extinction hovered over every fire. Though they had no words for it, they must have felt it deeply. The knowledge that their lives were precarious, that the world had already erased nearly all their kind. A single night without food, a single storm too strong, a single wound untended, could bring not just death, but erasure. And yet, even in such darkness, they endured. They sang crude songs, carved tools with care, told stories through gesture and sound. The instinct to remember, to carry knowledge forward, did not vanish with scarcity. It grew sharper, for in a world reduced to whispers, every voice mattered. By the height of the bottleneck, humanity had been reduced to a shadow of itself. Where once many species of human had walked the earth, now only fragments remained. Where once countless fires dotted the plains, now only a few flickered weakly in hidden valleys and coastal caves. The silence of extinction had nearly claimed us. The survivors could not have known their numbers. They did not know they were fewer than the herds they hunted, fewer than the flocks of birds overhead. But they must have felt it in their bones, the emptiness of the land, the absence of other voices, the crushing weight of isolation. To live was to live on the edge of nothingness, and yet, this reduction did not erase humanity, it concentrated it. Every surviving clan carried within it the memory of thousands who had vanished. Every child born was not only the continuation of a family, but of the species itself. Each life was history balanced on a fragile thread. The world had narrowed them to the brink of disappearance, but fragility was not defeat. From these few, from this tiny remnant of humanity, the future would grow again. Ahead lay the hardest years yet, life at the very edge of survival, a time when every breath, every spark of fire, every step into the unknown was weighed against extinction. To imagine life at the edge of extinction, strip away every comfort, every certainty, picture a world where a clan might number no more than a dozen souls, where the fire burns low because wood is scarce, where each meal is a question and each night a trial. This was humanity 900,000 years ago, reduced to scattered fragments holding on against the storm. Shelters were crude caves when they could be found, or huts of branches and hides when nothing else was available. These offered little protection against the cold winds that swept across the land. Families huddled together for warmth, bodies pressed close, the fire their only shield against the dark. Even so, many nights ended in frost-bitten fingers, in coughs that grew into silence. Food was never certain. Hunters set out knowing they might return with nothing. A rabbit, a fish, even insects. Anything that could fill the stomach was welcome. The great hunts of the past, chasing herds across the plains, were gone. Now survival meant scavenging, persistence, ingenuity. Mothers dug roots from frozen ground. Children searched for shellfish along icy shores. Elders showed where moss could be scraped from rocks. Each bite of food was victory.
No matter how small, fear was constant. Predators had not disappeared. Lions still stalked the plains, leopards crouched in the trees, hyenas prowled the edges of the firelight. But the greatest predator was hunger itself, striking with equal ferocity and leaving no bones to mark its passage. Hunger weakened the body, dulled the senses, broke the spirit. Against hunger, no spear was sharp enough. And yet, amid this struggle, life continued. Children were born, fragile but alive. Laughter still rose in the darkness, rough and fleeting but real. Stories were told in gestures and crude sounds, not only to teach survival, but to remind each other that they were human, that they belonged to something greater than the cold and the night. In these scattered enclaves of survival, cooperation was no longer just an advantage. It was the only reason the fire still burned. A single selfish act could doom an entire clan. If a hunter kept meat to himself, if a mother hid food for her child alone, if an elder refused to share knowledge, the balance shattered. Trust was survival, and it was woven into every gesture, every meal, every night by the fire. Food was always shared, no matter how little. When a hunter returned with a rabbit or a few fish, the clan gathered and divided it, even if it meant each person tasted only a mouthful. The act was more than practical, it was symbolic. It reminded them that they endured not as individuals, but as a unit, a fragile island of humanity in a hostile world. Rituals took shape in this crucible of scarcity. After a successful hunt, the clan might circle the fire, chanting rough sounds, imitating the animals' movements, celebrating not only the kill, but the survival it meant. Around the bodies of the dead, care was given, sometimes burials in shallow graves, sometimes placement in caves, sometimes simple covering with stones. These were not yet religions, but they were signs that life was more than eating and breathing. They carried the first sparks of meaning, of reverence, of culture. Songs and stories, crude as they were, carried wisdom across the generations. A child who learned a chant about rivers would remember where to find water. A gesture, imitating the movement of a predator, could warn of danger, even without words. In this way, culture became not luxury, but lifeline. Without it, knowledge would vanish with the elders, and survival would vanish with it. Despite the despair, moments of joy persisted. Children played, chasing each other around the fire, imitating hunts with sticks. Hunters laughed at their failures, turning danger into story. These fleeting sparks of humanity were defiance, small flames against the vast night, proof that even on the brink of extinction, the human spirit still lived. The greatest weight these survivors carried was not only hunger or cold, but the crushing silence of isolation. For centuries, humanity had been many, different lineages spread across continents, countless fires burning in the night. Now, in the age of collapse, a clan could live and die without ever seeing another human outside their own circle. Loneliness gnawed at them. Each time hunters scanned the horizon, they looked not only for prey but for smoke, some sign that others still endured. More often than not, the horizon was empty. Children grew up believing their tiny band might be the last, that the world belonged to predators and storms, not to people. When chance encounters did occur, they were electric with tension. To see strangers was to confront the unknown. Were they rivals, desperate and dangerous, or allies, equally fragile, equally in need? A single meeting might end in violence, with spears raised and blood spilled, or it might end in union, with families merging, knowledge exchanged, and the thread of humanity strengthened by a fragile alliance. The fear of being alone wove itself into their stories. Around the fire, gestures and chants spoke of other clans, imagined or remembered, as if conjuring their existence could keep the loneliness at bay. The dead too remained part of the clan's world. Their memories were kept alive in stories, their resting places marked with care. In a world that seemed intent on erasing them, remembering became resistance. And yet, for all the emptiness, they did not stop living. They hunted, they gathered, they laughed, sang and mourned. They carried fire from one camp to the next, sparks leaping forward into a future they could not imagine. Fragile though they were, they endured, and in that endurance lay the possibility that humanity was not finished. The edge was where they lived, not just geographically, in the margins of rivers and caves, but on the very edge of existence itself. Every fire that burned in those years was a defiance, every child born a rebellion against the silence pressing in from all sides. Though their lives were hard, stripped of plenty, stripped of certainty, they carried forward the one thing that mattered most: continuity. Each story told, each tool passed to younger hands, each lesson in survival was a bridge across the abyss of extinction. Without these bridges, humanity would have fallen into the void. They did not know they were living through a bottleneck, did not know that their numbers had been reduced to nearly nothing. To them, they were simply surviving, doing what had always been done: hunting, gathering, raising children, burying the dead. But in that ordinary struggle lay the extraordinary truth: they were the last hope of their kind, and they succeeded, not in triumph, not in abundance, but in survival itself. Against hunger, against loneliness, against a world that seemed determined to erase them, they held on. From their fires, our fire continues. From their fragile thread, the vast tapestry of humanity would one day be woven. The edge had been endured. Now came the turning point, the thread that survived, the genetic legacy carried through the into the future of all humankind. Out of the silence, out of the emptiness, a thread remained. Humanity had been reduced to its barest essence, tiny clans clinging to life in hidden valleys, coastal refuges, and forest edges. 99% of their kind had vanished, but not all. Against all odds, a few survived. They were not many, perhaps only a few thousand across the entire planet, a number so small that the species balanced on the edge of erasure, and yet that smallness was also strength. It forced them together, bound them by cooperation and necessity, shaped them into something capable of enduring where multitudes had failed. Every surviving clan carried the weight of history. Within their bones lived the legacy of millions who had perished. Within their memories, the lessons of countless generations lingered. In their children, the possibility of a future stretched forward, like the faint glow of fire in the night. This thread was fragile, thinner than any species could bear, but it held. Across storms and droughts, across hunger and solitude, across centuries of trial, it held, and from it, all of us are descended. Every language spoken today, every face, every song, every story, each is an echo of that thread that refused to break. The survivors did not know the weight they carried. To them, each day was a struggle, like any other. Hunt, gather, protect, endure. But every child they raised was more than a son or daughter. Each was the continuation of humanity itself, a flicker of life in a world that had nearly extinguished them. Genes that might otherwise have been diluted in a larger world were now concentrated. The diversity of humanity shrank, leaving only the inheritance of these few. All modern humans carry their mark, their legacy, encoded in our blood. We are not the descendants of many, but of a small handful who weathered the storm. But survival was more than biology. Culture, fragile as it was, survived with them. The shaping of stone into sharper blades, the memory of safe valleys, the ritual of sharing food. These invisible tools passed through the bottleneck with as much importance as fire itself. Each time an elder taught a child how to read the tracks of prey, or how to keep a fire alive through the night, they were not only preserving knowledge, they were preserving humanity. The survivors did not thrive, they endured. They buried their dead with care, even when food was scarce. They laughed around fires, even when hunger gnawed their stomachs. They taught, they remembered, they hoped, even when there was little reason to hope. In these acts, repeated across generations, the thread held firm. The bottleneck did not erase humanity, it refined it. What passed through was not countless species, but a small resilient lineage forged by adversity. The world had nearly ended us. Instead, it had tempered us. From this narrow thread, the future began to weave itself. The survivors did not know they were the foundation of a new humanity, yet everything we are traces back to them. Their endurance carried forward, not only bodies, but the seeds of culture, imagination, and connection that would one day flourish into civilization. The pressure of the bottleneck had stripped humanity of abundance, but had sharpened resilience. Cooperation was no longer optional. It was instinct. Memory was not luxury. It was survival. Imagination was not idle. It was a tool as vital as fire. These traits, carried within the survivors, became the bedrock of our species. Even in their isolation, sparks of continuity bridged the gap between generations. Stories grew richer, tools more refined, bonds more unbreakable. Each small innovation, a better blade, a sturdier shelter, a more efficient way of sharing food, was not lost in the void, but carried forward, repeated, taught, remembered. In this way, the survivors planted the seeds of the human future, even as they lived on the brink of extinction. When the climate finally relented, when the ice retreated, and the rains returned, it was these fragile groups who stepped forward to reclaim the world. They emerged not as a multitude of lineages, but as the single surviving thread of humanity. Every expansion that followed, every migration, every discovery, every step towards civilization was built upon their endurance. We are their children. Every heartbeat today is a continuation of their defiance, their refusal to let the fire die. The bottleneck had done its work. Humanity was no longer many voices scattered across the earth, but one fragile thread stretched through time. 99% of our kind had vanished, and yet the fire still burned in the hands of a few. They did not live to see the scale of what they had accomplished. To them, survival was nothing more than the next hunt, the next shelter, the next breath. But in their persistence, they carried forward the essence of what it means to be human. They endured for us. From that thread, all language, all culture, all memory, all history would one day unfold. Every story told, every tool shaped, every city built, is an echo of their defiance. They stood at the brink of nothingness, and they did not fall. The Great Bottleneck was not triumph, it was trial, it was suffering and loss on a scale we can hardly imagine. But from that crucible came the survivors, the ones who would shape the destiny of our species. The thread had survived, and now with the world beginning to shift once more, that thread would spread, grow, and weave itself into the vast tapestry of humanity. The silence of near extinction was ending. Ahead lay renewal, expansion, and the long road to what we would become.
For centuries, the world had pressed humanity to the brink, reducing them to fragments scattered across desolate lands. But nothing in the earth lasts forever, not even catastrophe. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the world began to change once more. The rains returned. Rivers that had been little more than scars in the ground swelled again with water. Valleys that had lain barren sprouted with grass, the faint green of renewal spreading across the land. Herds of animals, gazelle, bison, even mammoth in the colder regions, began to return to the plains, their migrations drawn back by the promise of food. The silence that had haunted humanity for generations was broken by the sound of hooves and wings. The ice too began to retreat. Glaciers that had once marched southward halted their advance, then pulled back, leaving behind carved valleys and cold lakes. The winds grew gentler, the snows less frequent. The bitter cold nights that had frozen countless fires now gave way to a climate more forgiving, a fragile mercy offered by the earth. For the scattered survivors, the change was life itself. The world that had nearly killed them was opening again, offering them a chance to breathe, to grow, to step out of the shadows of extinction. Fires that had burned in lonely caves now flickered in the open air, their smoke rising not in defiance but in hope. The survivors did not know they were stepping into renewal. They only knew that the hunts grew less desperate, that roots were easier to find, that children no longer starved so quickly. But in these small mercies lay the seed of expansion. From a thread stretched thin across time, humanity was beginning to weave again. With the return of water and prey came the return of life. Children who once had little chance to survive now grew into hunters and gatherers themselves. Births no longer meant a gamble against hunger alone. They meant the possibility of future, of continuity. Slowly, numbers began to rise. At first, the growth was fragile. A harsh season could still cut deep. A storm could still wipe out a camp. But unlike before, there were second chances. Herds returned after migration. Rivers filled again after drought. Even when clans suffered, the land offered recovery. And recovery meant that life no longer felt like walking on the edge of a blade. The survivors spread outward from their refuges. Where there had once been only silence, fires began to reappear in new valleys. Hunters who had lived alone in empty plains now saw smoke in the distance, signs of other humans returning to the world. These encounters carried the same tension as before: fear, rivalry, hunger. But they also carried something new: recognition. They were no longer the last. They were part of a species finding itself again, and with new encounters came exchange. Knowledge that had been isolated in scattered clans began to move once more. A technique for shaping stone spread from one fire to another. A ritual for honoring the hunt passed from clan to clan. Each meeting did more than share food or mates. It rebuilt the invisible web of culture that had been torn apart by centuries of scarcity. The world that had nearly silenced humanity was now filling again with its voice. Weak at first, fragile, uncertain, but unmistakably growing. As humanity spread once more across the land, something long dormant began to awaken culture. It did not arrive suddenly, fully formed, but grew slowly, flickering like sparks that caught and spread with each encounter between clans. Rituals that had once been whispered in isolation now took on new life when shared. A chant imitating the cry of a hunted animal, once the secret of a single valley, now echoed across plains. A burial custom, placing stones over the dead, spread from one group to another, each fire adding its own variations. These acts were not yet religion, not yet tradition as we know it, but they were the beginnings of identity, the sense that humanity was more than mere survival. Cooperation flourished in ways that had been impossible during the bottleneck. In times of absolute scarcity, every stranger was a rival, every fire a threat. But in this new age of renewal, the land offered just enough for clans to coexist, to trade, to learn. A stranger might bring not only competition, but new tools, new knowledge, new mates to strengthen the bloodlines. Where once encounters had ended in silence, now they sometimes ended in alliance. Innovation quickened, stone blades grew sharper, more precise, spears were balanced better, their wooden shafts hardened in fire. Hunters learned to track not only by sight but by subtle signs, bent grass, broken twigs, the faint smell of animal trails. These skills, once the property of single families, now spread rapidly as encounters multiplied. Knowledge no longer died with the old, it was reborn in the young of many clans. Around the fire, stories lengthened. They no longer told only of hunger and loss, but of journeys, of encounters, of lessons learned. For the first time in countless generations, humanity was not merely enduring, it was growing, sharing, remembering together. The earth had opened again, and humanity was beginning to fill it with firelight. The change was not sudden, but it was unmistakable. Where once the world had seemed empty, now it stirred with life. Fires reappeared in valleys, smoke curled into skies that had long been bare, and voices rose again in the night. Humanity, though still fragile, was no longer only surviving, it was beginning to renew itself. The scars of the bottleneck remained. Memories of hunger lingered in stories, lessons carved into every gesture and every ritual. The survivors never forgot how close they had come to vanishing. But those memories did not only weigh them down, they guided them. They knew to guard fire as if it were life itself. They knew to share food, to teach children, to trust cooperation. These lessons, born in near extinction, became the foundation of resilience. As the climate eased, humanity began to move outward once more. From caves and valleys, from coasts and rivers, they spread carefully, cautiously, following herds, following water, following the promise of land that could sustain them. Their numbers were still few, but their presence was growing. The earth that had once nearly erased them was now opening, slowly, cautiously, as if offering a second chance. And humanity, scarred but unbroken, stepped forward to take it. The silence of near extinction was ending. The world was ready to hear the human voice again. For thousands of years, humanity had whispered at the edge of silence. But slowly, step by step, season by season, that whisper grew louder. The survivors of the bottleneck began to multiply. Children lived long enough to become parents themselves. Families grew into clans, clans into bands of wandering hunters, each generation adding new voices to the fragile song of humanity. Where once a valley might have held only one lonely fire, now 2 or 3 might glow against the night. The distance between groups began to shrink. Smoke on the horizon no longer meant only rivals or danger, it meant possibility, the chance that others had endured, the chance that humanity was not alone. The land itself welcomed this rise, with rains returning and herds growing strong again. Food was no longer only scraps and roots. Hunts could succeed more often, yields could be shared, bellies could be filled. It was not abundance, not yet, but it was enough to allow growth, and growth was everything. Children became the measure of hope. Their cries broke the silence of caves. Their laughter returned to the plains. Every birth was not only joy but victory, proof that the near extinction was ending, that humanity had begun to rise from its long night. The silence of the bottleneck was fading. In its place came voices, firelight, and the fragile beginning of renewal. As clans multiplied, the land that had once felt empty began to feel alive again. Trails grew more familiar. As hunters crossed paths, rivers bore the footprints of many families, and the night skies reflected not one but several fires on distant hills. The earth was still vast, but humanity was no longer alone in it. Encounters between clans became more frequent. Sometimes these meetings echoed the old ways of rivalry. A glance could become a challenge, a scarce hunting ground could spark conflict, a moment of fear could end in violence. Spears were raised, voices shouted, and the silence of extinction gave way to the clash of survival. But not every meeting ended in blood. More often now, necessity encouraged caution. Strangers approached one another slowly, with open hands or gifts of stone, shell or meat. They exchanged not only goods but knowledge, a new way to chip flint, a remembered path to water, a story of animals seen in distant valleys. These exchanges, fragile though they were, wove invisible threads between groups that had once lived in isolation. Alliances formed, families merged across clans, weaving new bloodlines into the fragile human web. Rituals were shared, gestures spread, and chants learned in one fire circle might be repeated in another far away. For the first time in many generations, culture flowed outward again, carried not by migration alone but by connection. This growth was not without tension. More people meant more competition, more mouths to feed, more fires needing fuel, yet it also meant resilience. A clan struck by illness could find aid in neighbors. A failed hunt could be mended by sharing. Where once a single accident might have erased a lineage, now the bonds between groups gave humanity a buffer against the cruelty of chance. The silence was gone. In its place, the world once again began to echo with the voices of many humans, fragile but rising. As numbers grew, so too did the richness of life. The survivors of the bottleneck had carried only fragments of culture through the storm, but now, with more voices and more fires, those fragments expanded into diversity once again. Rituals became more elaborate. What had once been simple chants and gestures around the fire evolved into longer performances, weaving sound, movement and memory into shared meaning. A successful hunt might be reenacted with greater detail, every hunter adding his part, children mimicking animals, elders chanting rhythms that echoed like drums in what had once been survival. Retelling became the beginning of tradition. Tools also reflected this renewal. Stoneworking spread faster, innovations traveling from clan to clan. Blades were not only sharper but more varied, some suited for butchering, others for scraping hides, still others for shaping wood. Spears became more balanced, their points crafted with greater precision. What one group invented, another copied and improved. The fire of innovation leapt between humans as easily as sparks from a hearth. The act of sharing grew into something more than necessity. It became identity. To belong to a clan was to belong to a circle of firelight, to eat together, to sing together, to mourn together. But now, with more clans in contact, this sense of belonging stretched further. A gesture recognized between strangers, a ritual shared across valleys. These were the threads of a larger human fabric, fragile but expanding. Even language, or at least its earliest forms, may have grown stronger in this time. With more people, more encounters, more need to exchange knowledge, the sounds and signs passed between humans began to multiply, to stabilize, to carry more meaning. The silence of the bottleneck was not only being replaced by voices, it was being replaced by words. The earth was still harsh, survival still uncertain, but humanity was no longer only enduring, it was becoming again. By the time humanity truly began to rise again, the world no longer felt empty. Fires burned in more valleys, smoke curled into skies that had once carried only silence, and human voices carried farther than they had in centuries. The bottleneck was not forgotten. It lingered in every cautious gesture, every ritual of sharing, every story told about hunger and loss. But its grip was loosening. Now humanity could grow without fear that one storm, one drought, one failed hunt would erase it completely. The margins of survival were still narrow, but they were wider than before. Every child born was not only a continuation of a family but part of the return of the species. Every new fire was a declaration, we are still here. The silence that had nearly ended humanity was broken, and in its place a chorus was returning, voices rising from the edge of extinction, carrying firelight and memory into the future. This was not yet abundance, not yet triumph, but it was renewal. Humanity was climbing from the depths of its long night, ready to spread, to connect, to fill the world once again with its presence. The stage was set for the return of firelight, not only as survival but as symbol, as culture, as the glowing heart of a reborn humanity. For countless years, fire had been the fragile companion of humanity, stolen from lightning, guarded through storm and wind, carried from camp to camp like the very heartbeat of survival. In the age of silence, fires had grown rare, flickering only in scattered caves where the last survivors huddled against extinction. But now, with renewal, fire returned. Smoke began to rise from valleys long abandoned, from coasts once barren, from plains where predators had reigned alone. Each new fire was more than warmth. It was a declaration that humanity was alive, multiplying, spreading once more across the earth. To see firelight in the distance was no longer always a threat. It was recognition. Others like us had endured. The fire became the center of everything. Around it, food was shared, wounds tended, stories told. Its glow was safety against the dark, its sparks reminders that life continued. For the children born in this time, fire was not only survival, it was the first memory, the center of family, the heart of what it meant to be human. But fire was more than symbol. It allowed expansion. With warmth, humans could push into colder lands. With light, they could work longer, sharpen tools, prepare hides. With smoke, they could drive away insects, predators, even rival clans. Fire was no longer something borrowed from the earth. It was a power mastered, guarded, revered. The return of firelight marked the return of humanity itself. The world that had nearly erased them now burned once more with their presence. As the fires multiplied, so too did the connections between clans. Where once a single fire in the distance had sparked fear, now it carried the possibility of kinship. Slowly, carefully, groups approached one another, first with caution, then with offerings, meat, tools, shells, ochre. The fire made these encounters possible, for it was the one thing all humans recognized. Around fires, trust was built. Two clans that might have once fought could sit together in the glow, eating from the same carcass, warming themselves under the same sparks. For a night, rivalry was set aside, replaced by the ancient rhythm of sharing. The fire was neutral ground, a symbol of humanity itself. It was here, in these gatherings, that culture accelerated. Songs grew more complex, dances became more coordinated, stories lengthened into legends. A gesture invented by one clan spread quickly to another, passed across flames and generations alike. Techniques for shaping stone or working bone moved faster than ever before, carried by alliances and wanderers. Fire was not only warmth, it was a transmitter of knowledge, a hub of exchange. The more fires there were, the stronger humanity became. The network of clans, once shattered by isolation, was reforged in flickering circles of light scattered across the continents. Each fire was a beacon, a promise that the silence of extinction would never return. For the first time in countless generations, humanity was not only enduring, it was flourishing, building not just survival but a web of meaning that stretched beyond any single clan or valley. The firelight was returning, and with it the beginning of something larger than survival. The slow birth of civilization. With fire at their center, clans began to see themselves not just as families, but as part of something greater. The glow of flames did more than keep predators at bay. It created identity. To sit together around the light was to belong, to be human. Rituals deepened. Fire became the stage for dances that imitated the hunt, for chants that echoed into the night, for gestures that bound memory into performance. Some clans smeared ash upon their faces, others painted symbols on stone with red ochre, marking their presence in the world. These were the beginnings of culture, not tied to survival alone but to meaning, to a sense that life was more than the endless chase for food. Children learned their world in firelight,
They heard stories of ancestors, of hunts long past, of spirits imagined in the winds and stars. Even without true language, these stories carried lessons, hopes and warnings. They gave shape to the chaos of existence, making survival feel like part of a larger narrative. The fire was also witness to grief. The dead were mourned in its glow, their names or sounds that marked them spoken aloud, their bodies sometimes burned, sometimes buried, always remembered. In these moments, fire linked the living to the lost, binding past and present in ways no predator, no storm, no hunger could erase. Everywhere the fire burned, it proclaimed the same truth. Humanity had returned, scattered and scarred though they were. The survivors were weaving themselves into a people again, one circle of fire at a time. The return of firelight was more than survival. It was a signal to the earth itself. Where once the land had fallen into silence, now it pulsed with the rhythm of human presence. Smoke curled into the skies over valleys, rivers and coasts, stitching together a map of survival that was becoming a map of renewal. Each new fire was both fragile and eternal. Fragile because a storm could still drown it, hunger could still extinguish it, predators could still scatter the people who kept it alive. Eternal because each spark carried within it the memory of generations who had refused to let the flames die. In this glow, humanity was reborn, no longer reduced to a handful of isolated survivors. They were becoming many again, many fires, many voices, many stories. The bottleneck had nearly broken them, but fire had carried them through. Now, it carried them forward. From these gatherings, from these rituals, from these exchanges, the foundations of everything to come were being laid. The fire was not yet the hearth of cities, not yet the forge of empires, not yet the altar of gods, but it was all of these in sea. The silence of near extinction had been shattered, firelight had returned to the world, and with it the certainty that humanity was not only alive, but destined to grow. The future awaited, vast, unknown, but no longer unreachable. The world had tested humanity and nearly erased it. For thousands of years, the species had hovered on the edge of silence, reduced to a few scattered clans. Their survival, a thread so thin it might have snapped at any moment, but it did not. Against all odds, the thread held, and from it, the future unfolded. As the earth warmed and rains returned, humanity began to move outward once more. Fires that had flickered in isolation spread across valleys, across coasts, across the plains. Children multiplied, families grew, clans expanded. Slowly, the land that had fallen silent during the bottleneck filled again with voices. The survivors did not know they carried the legacy of all who had come before. They did not know that every human to come, every farmer, every city builder, every storyteller, every thinker would trace their ancestry back to them. To the survivors, life was still only the next hunt, the next shelter, the next fire. But to us, looking back, they were the foundation of everything. The fragile rituals of sharing, of mourning, of storytelling became stronger. Innovation, born of necessity, accelerated. Stone blades grew sharper, spears were hardened in fire, gestures lengthened into more complex communication. These small changes, carried forward through generations, became the stepping stones toward language, toward culture, toward civilization. The bottleneck had nearly ended humanity, but instead it had shaped it. Scarcity had forged resilience, isolation had forged imagination, fragility had forged endurance. The species that emerged from the trial was not only surviving, it was prepared for the long journey ahead. From this rebirth began the path toward the future. Renewal brought not only survival, but movement. Once again, humanity began to walk. They left the caves where they had endured the long night of scarcity, stepped out of hidden valleys, and followed rivers and herds into the wider world. What had once been a prison of isolation became a frontier of possibility. The migrations began cautiously, but they soon stretched far. From Africa's fertile refuges, bands of humans pressed outward, northward into grasslands carved by retreating glaciers, eastward into forests and coasts rich with life. Each step carried fire, tools, and memory. Each step widened the fragile thread into a growing web of humanity. As populations expanded, diversity re-emerged. Clans developed their own rituals, their own songs, their own marks left on stone and earth. One group might carve bones with patterns of lines, another might paint with red ochre on cave walls. These acts were not yet art as we know it, but but they were signs of imagination flourishing in new spaces. Innovation accelerated with movement. Hunters discovered new animals, new plants, new challenges. Spears became more refined, stone tools more specialized. Some groups experimented with fishing nets of woven fibers, others with carrying baskets made of reeds. Each discovery spread slowly, carried in memory across encounters, weaving together a patchwork of survival strategies. Most important of all, humanity was no longer confined to a single fragile place. By spreading, they built resilience against chance. A storm that destroyed one clan no longer threatened the species. A drought that struck one valley was balanced by abundance in another. Expansion transformed humanity from a whisper into a chorus, scattered yet united by common ancestry. The fire that had once nearly gone out was now burning in many lands, many hands. The silence of extinction was behind them. Ahead lay the vast story of humanity's rise. With more fires burning across the earth, humanity's greatest tool began to sharpen communication. What had once been simple gestures and scattered sounds grew richer as clans met more often, exchanged knowledge, and taught their children not only survival but memory. The first steps toward language were born in this expansion. Sounds became more consistent, gestures more complex, meaning more precise. A cry no longer meant only danger. It could mean lion, or leopard, or snake. A gesture no longer meant only hunger. It could mean meat, roots, or fish. These refinements turned survival into something more. They turned memory into legacy. Stories lengthened, no longer confined to warnings or instructions. They grew into narratives that carried identity and meaning. A child might learn not only how to hunt, but why the ancestors had done so, what spirits guided the animals, what lessons lay hidden in the stars. These were the beginnings of myth, of shared imagination, of culture that stretched beyond a single lifetime. Innovation fed on communication. A sharper blade invented in one valley could be explained, demonstrated, imitated in another. Fire-making techniques spread not only by observation, but by teaching, by words or signs passed deliberately. Cooperation became faster, knowledge more enduring, and with imagination came vision. Humanity began to think not only of the present, but of the future. To plant an idea in a child's mind was to plant survival in tomorrow. To imagine a hunt before it happened was to increase its chance of success. To tell a story of the dead was to give meaning to loss and continuity to life. The bottleneck had left humanity fragile, but it had also prepared them. Reduced to almost nothing, they had emerged with the traits that would define them forever: cooperation, memory, and the gift of communication. From these roots, the towering tree of civilization would one day grow. From a whisper, humanity had become a chorus again. The fires that once flickered in lonely caves now burned across continents. The clans that had once wondered if they were the last now met others, exchanged gifts, shared mates, and told stories that bound them to something larger than themselves. The bottleneck was not forgotten. It lived in their rituals of sharing, in their reverence for fire, in their instinct to cooperate even when resources were scarce. It shaped the very core of what it meant to be human. Scarcity had taught resilience, loneliness had taught imagination, fragility had taught endurance. Out of near extinction, humanity had forged the traits that would carry it forward forever. The future awaited them. Language would grow richer, tools sharper, stories deeper. One day they would build cities, chart the stars, shape the earth itself. But all of it, every word spoken, every stone raised, every fire lit, would trace its ancestry back to the few who endured when the world tried to erase them. We are their children. Every breath we take, every dream we chase, every story we tell is proof of their survival. The bottleneck did not end us, it defined us. The silence of near extinction had passed. Humanity had risen from the edge of nothingness, carrying fire, memory, and hope into a future they could not imagine. But we now live. The story of survival was complete. The story of civilization was about to begin.